Welcome to a very special episode of the Underground Bunker Podcast. This is your proprietor, Tony Ortega. And with me is my old friend, John Sweeney. How are you, man?
I am very well, thank you. Hail Zenu and all that.
Well,
Once again, I'd like to say, I say it whenever I talk about Scientology. I first said, I'm living proof that Scientology is a load of nonsense. In English, it's a load of old bollocks, because if you spread the story that 75 million years ago, the space alien Lord Zenu brought space aliens to Earth and blew them up with hydrogen bombs inside volcanoes, and the remains of those pesky dead space alien souls are the cause of all humanity's woes, you will die, and everybody you tell that story to will also die or be very troubled. And I have been doing this since 2007, and I am living proof that Scientology is rubbish.
well, that's a good place to start. Let's start there. 2007. Uh, I was just getting to the Village Voice, and you had made this amazing documentary for Panorama, the BBC program, investigating Scientology. And one of the great features of that was that at that point, Scientology was still bringing journalists in for some visits. They had a spokesman, Tommy Davis, who would actually talk to journalists. And so you got to visit some really interesting Scientology sites. You got to interview some Scientology celebrities. I mean, they never do this anymore. And of course, the most famous thing was you were stalked the whole time by not just Tommy Davis, but his partner in crime, Mike Rinder. And this became a major part of that documentary. And of course, the thing everyone remembers is that Tommy really got under your skin. And then what happened, John?
I'm embarrassed to say that I lost my temper. I apologize then, and I apologize now. But when I lost my temper, it was, I've got a resonant voice, you can tell, but actually when I lose it, I really lose it. And I sounded like a kind of jet engine or an exploding tomato. And it was, and it was the particular argument was about something which I felt a little guilty about. And it's fascinating how well Scientologists, people like Tommy Davis and Mike Rinder, though Mike Rinder was the silent partner on that day, what they do is how they play on your weaknesses. They play upon a sense of guilt. And the particular guilt I had was there was a great guy called Sean. What was his surname? I've forgotten his.
Was it Lonsdale?
Yeah. So Sean Lonsdale was an anti-Scientologist who used to post, used to walk around Clearwater where he lived, and with sometimes with placards with very ironic and rather witty denunciations of the cult. Remember, I mean, your listeners are all fully aware of all this stuff, but essentially, Scientology says it's a force for good, and that they say that I'm a bigot, a liar, and psychotic. I've met more than enough ex-members of the Church of Scientology who have told me that it's a brainwashing cult. I believe it is a brainwashing cult, and it's stuff about fighting this space alien Satan Lord Zenu is dark nonsense. They tell their brainwashed adepts so that they can milk them for money. Anyway, Sean Lonsdale he films Scientology zombies marching hither and yon, to and fro and to the various bits of their empire in downtown Clearwater in Florida, and they really don't like him. And as ever, they hunt for his black moments in his life, and he was gay or bisexual, and he'd been for a time a male prostitute, and was twice arrested and convicted, I think, of having sex with other men in public places. Now, this is embarrassing, but he wasn't ashamed of it in a ghastly way. It wasn't something he would anybody would wish to advertise, but nevertheless, he realised he'd made some mistakes in his when he was young, and had served whatever penalties. Well, none of these aren't great crimes, but nevertheless, Scientology used this against him, and I met him, and the first thing I said to him was, aren't you a bit of a nutter doing what you're doing? Really, sticking your head in
Wow.
the mouth of Scientology.
Right.
And he kind of answered the question in a very smart and good way. And I liked him. I admired him. He had real courage. And in the middle of this conversation, in the top of a car park in Florida, overlooking one of their orgs, suddenly there is a car, and then a man gets out of the car. He's wearing dark glasses, and it's Tommy Davis. And Tommy Davis arrived, and he's like some kind of bad version of a Hollywood version of a kind of DA who's got the file on some mafia don, and he's got a file with him, and he starts reading out the charge sheets against Sean Lonsdale, and um, then and as he's reading out this stuff, I said, well, hold on a second, Sean isn't an animal. He's here. What do you say to this? And Sean says, well, can Scientology help me with any of these terrible problems I've got? Really witty, really witty. And the fact that and then Tommy Davis sort of comes on to me, and and I said, you're not giving us any access. What have you got to hide? And then he comes nose to nose with me and kind of threatens me. And I stand my ground and I say, give us some access. Let us, if you're proud of what you've got, let's see it. And, and I remember my brilliant producer, Sarah Mole, who comes from Essex. And Sarah used to say, I think he fancies you. Tommy was really kind of really very, very close. And anyway, they went away to cause yet more trouble. And then later on, so what happened was, all these events, they're in a blur, but it felt like being in a battle royal with a church, as they like to call it. You can't see this, but I'm putting church in inverted commas. And they came to our hotel at midnight, but Sarah, who is very clever, had worked out that Scientology attacks people like me, and they wait till our camera is locked up in the room, and then they pants. And so she had a small camera with her at all times. We were returning from dinner. It's midnight. And there's Tommy Davis with, I think Mike Rinder's there, pale, ghostly. I didn't realize this at the time, but he'd been in the hole for 3 or 4 years and hadn't seen daylight
Yeah.
and you could see he looked like a prisoner who'd just been plucked out of an oubliette. That's a French word for prison where they forget you, from the verb oublier, an oubliette. And he'd been, anyway, so he's there kind of looking very, very sinister. And there's a Scientology cameraman, a guy with a German name. I forget his name. I've written all about this in my book, Church of Fear. Anyway, but we've got a camera, and Tommy Davis kind of he's hassling me, and he's got a microphone. And I said, but listen, excuse me, we've just come back from dinner, and you're harassing us at the hotel. And frankly, this is all a bit creepy. Here's your microphone. So we filmed all of this. We filmed all of this on Sarah's small camera. Bill Brown, our brilliant cameraman, did that. So battle is joined. They come to a hotel. They hire creepy private eyes. We film one of these guys at breakfast staring at us in the car park. a creepy guy, and it's what Rick Ross, the great cult buster, says, is that they call this a noisy investigation. They want you to know that they're investigating you.
Right.
They want you to be afraid. There's a car chase in LA, and I learned to drive in Sarajevo during the war, so I know how to move a car quickly. And I basically catch up with the people who are following us, and I knock on the traffic lights, and I go and knock on the door at the window. Are you from the Church of Scientology? They show us a whole bunch of of members of the church who are high profile, including Tommy's mum, the actress Anne Archer, whose bunny got boiled in Fatal Attraction. Leah Remini, who's still in at that point in 2007.
Right.
Leah, by the way, struck me as being far and away the most interesting, the most thoughtful, and the least non-human of all these
Right.
space aliens. And we kind of liked each other. And actually, I didn't realize it, but she was, you could feel from the tenor of our conversation that although she took the piss out of me and although she mocked me, she did it in a funny and human and humane way.
Right.
But there was kind of the pressure on all of us was enormous. And remember, there's just three of us: Sarah Mole, the producer, Bill Brown, the cameraman, and me. And they had like 4 or 5 cameras, and everywhere I went to, Tommy Davis would pop up, or if not him, a private eye, or somebody I felt like was a private eye. And the pressure sort of grew and grew. At one point during these interminable sessions where there would be one Hollywood celebrity and then a kind of Z-lister person who was big in the church who I never knew, and off we went. And at one point, I decided to hold a meeting with Sarah and Bill, and there was nowhere we could go to because we were inside Scientology's crazy celebrity center in LA. And so we all went to the loo, and the 3 of us all went. We were having a meeting, and then suddenly there's a knock on the door, and it's Tommy. I said, "John, are you in there?" "Yes." "All 3 of you? All 3 of you in the toilet together?" And I said, "Yes, we're having a BBC meeting." "All 3 of you in the toilet?" "Yes, it's a BBC requirement." But it's funny, and it was dark because this unrelenting pressure.
Yeah.
And I think on the 7th day, I said to Sarah, "I can't do this anymore." And Sarah's from Essex, as I said, and she said, "Shut up and do your job." And it was only afterwards, when she reviewed the rushes, that she realized, partly because she was playing second camera, and because you're filming, you don't actually see what you're filming because you're looking through the lens, not the big picture. And so that she didn't properly understand until until she saw everything in the edit, just how intense the pressure was on me. And then they took us to the Psychiatry Museum of Death exhibition, which is a permanent exhibition, or at least it was anyway, on Sunset Boulevard in LA. And basically, this exhibition tries to tell you a big dark lie, that psychiatry is Nazi pseudoscience. Now, psychiatry is an honest attempt by doctors to help treat the mentally ill, and that's never easy. And so in the history of psychiatry, there have been a lot of pretty gruesome mistakes, as medicine of the time, this 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries, have made some big mistakes about how you treat mentally ill people. But that doesn't mean it's fundamentally Nazi or that it's fundamentally pseudoscience.
Right.
That's just not true. And I'm not enough, and I wasn't then, and I'm not now, enough of an expert on psychiatry to properly express where they were wrong, where Tommy and Mike Rinder and the others who were all baiting me were wrong. And then, and so I feel as if their fluency and their demented nonsense, which they're ramming down their throat, is getting to me. And I feel a kind of an incoherent rage building up at me. By the way, this is all deliberate. This is what they do.
Yeah.
And then there's this moment where Tommy talks to me, and then you protected your friend, your friend, you treated him with kid gloves. Your friend, the sexual pervert, Sean Lonsdale. Hold on. You weren't there at the beginning of the interview. You treated your friend Sean Lonsdale. Tommy's voice is rising now. This is how I remember it. Sex pervert Sean Lonsdale, and then I just go, "You are not there for the beginning of the interview. You are not." Now you listen to me. And that was the moment that I became famous in Britain and around the world for losing my temper with the Church of Scientology. I apologize then, and I apologize now.
Well, it is a famous moment. It's a wonderful moment. Tommy, and of course, I think a lot of people associate you and Tommy Davis together. I mean, that whenever people think of you, they think of Tommy. When they think of Tommy, they think of you. And that was 2007. Wonderful documentary that came out. I think people thoroughly understood. I know Scientology tried to do something with that footage and to try to, harm your reputation, but I don't think it did. I think people could totally understand where you were coming from. And then there's the most wonderful follow-up, because later that year, Mike Rinder escaped. And we stayed, kind of undercover for a while, under the radar for a while. And then in 2010, you were able to do this wonderful follow-up documentary where now, with Mike Rinder's help, you could go back and have him explain, yes, we were following you. Yes, we were trying to mess with you. And that was just it just was so satisfying, wasn't it, to be able to go back and do the same story, but now with the cooperation of Mike?
Yes. By the way, for some weird reason, the BBC have taken down the first documentary, which is called Scientology and Me. And I was talking to a former colleague who was saying that's a bit weird, and it's so it may be somewhat. I think you can find it on the internet. You can certainly see me screaming, but to understand why I'm screaming, you need to watch the full context of it. I think Secrets of Scientology, the second film, is up there still, but I don't think the BBC is still putting it out. And I don't know whether that's because Scientology has made some legal arguments to the BBC, and I've left the corporation now, so I'm not on the inside track of that. But I find that a little worrying, because I think, as a matter for the public good, the BBC should continue to put that film up there.
Yes,
so you could ask about.
Yeah.
But essentially, the second film is the rematch. It is Muhammad Ali versus George Foreman, and I've had my troubles, but I come out whatever it is, dancing like a butterfly and stinging like a bee. And I've got the great advantage that this time Mike switched. Now, what happened was that Mike knew that he would have to carry the can for the appalling mess that Scientology and Me created for David Miscavige, Scientology's thumping Pope, if you like. A big failure of both films, in my view, Tony, is that we didn't tell all the truth about the thumping Pope, David Miscavige. Once again, he denies everything or concern deny any wrongdoing. But there is overmuch evidence that David Miscavige is a psychotic bully who hits people wildly for no good reason. And we'd heard that he had physically beaten up Mike Rinder. And at one point during the filming of Scientology and Me, I put that to Mike Rinder and he denies it.
Right.
And there was a moment, and Mike writes about it in his book, which everybody should read. It's a great book, a Billion Years, in which he remembers. I think this is my recollection of reading it. I read it about 4 or 5 months ago, but he knows he's lying. I ask him, have you ever been thumped? Have you ever been hit by David Miscavige? No, that's a lie. And he was lying. And he was lying to defend a man who beat him up, who was horrible to him, who abused him. And so what Mike Rinder did was he left. And he actually left while we were making that program. He just totally went off the grid, went off the radar. A long time ago, he'd sold cars, or he's a natural salesman. He's got a real gift of the gab. And so we found out that he was selling cars in Virginia, and Sarah went out to see him and said, we'd love it if you talk to him. That very year, I think, or the year after he defected. By the way, in the middle of making the film, Scientology and Me, there were some really funny moments, and one of the funniest moments was I said to Tommy Davis is somewhere else, and I say to Mike Rinder, why I want to interview Scientology's Pope, David Miscavige. And we're off camera. It's in one of the few moments there aren't 7 cameras on us. Why won't you let me interview him? And Mike Rinder says, because John, you're an asshole. at which point both Sarah and Bill burst out laughing. And they're laughing at Mike Rinder's joke at my expense, but he delivers it beautifully. And because the cameras aren't rolling, he's coming out from behind his character, as you like.
Right.
And it's very funny. And that was fascinating because it was a moment when Mike saw that in our gang, if I was the leader, I wasn't really the leader, we're all kind of equals. But in our gang, you can take the piss out of each other and nothing happens to you.
Yeah.
Because that's how we do our stuff. Because we're actually normal human beings, but also the tolerance of laughter and mockery is, as the great Professor Robert Lifton wrote in one of his books about brainwashing and cults, that is the antidote, the enemy of the totalitarian mindset. And we all felt that Mike Rinder wanted to be in our gang where you could take the piss out of each other because we were equals.
Right.
His gang where you had to revere the leader. And so there was a bit of a rapport between Sarah and Mike. Sarah went out there, and then 3 years later, 2010, Mike sits down and tells me everything. He tells me about the abuse. He tells me about being hit. He tells me about a series of utterly bizarre DMs, messages on his BlackBerry from Savage. And there's stuff like YS, which stands for YS. What's it stand for?
It's
and then my favorite is YSCOHB,
right,
which stands for You Suck Cock on Hollywood Boulevard. This is the word of the Church of Scientology. And what I do is when I do a talk, or I used to, I haven't done it so often, but I should do, actually what I should do is do it in next time I'm in Kyiv, because Scientology is it's pushing its dark, nonsensical message to Ukraine as if Ukraine hasn't got enough problems.
Yeah.
But what I do is get members of the audience to read out these crazy texts from the Pope Miscavige. My favorite, as I said, is YSCOHB, You Suck Cock on Hollywood Boulevard. And that is the man at the heart of this dark monster.
Right.
He's a man who is incredibly abusive, who has has a sick mind, is in some way mentally ill, who denounces psychiatry and uses the power of mental kidnap over his adepts to keep them in a kind of dungeon of the mind. He milks them for their money and what talents or beauty they may have, and he is destroying human lives and the human spirit over and over again. And then Mike Rinder is, obviously he was, for a time, he was head of OSA, the Office of Special Affairs. He was Scientology's Himmler, if you like. He was a secret policeman who did terrible things to people, and I think he still feels deeply guilty about his past. But boy, did he suffer for it, and boy, has he done his best. In particular, his book, which is very generously written, sets out what he got so horribly wrong. And so part of the thing I feel very, it's one of the things I feel proud about in my life as a reporter and a journalist. And obviously I've made mistakes. I'm a human being, and journalism is a very, very human pursuit. But nevertheless, standing up to the Church of Scientology in 2007, before people with bigger, more clout than people like Louis Theroux and Lawrence Wright, before they got going, we had a go, and we troubled them. The thing I'm upset about or disappointed was we were unable to convince the BBC's lawyers to publish the story we knew to be true, but David Miscavige had a violent temper and went around hitting people. We knew it to be true. We had stacks of evidence, but the problem then was that the British libel courts, there's still a problem, but there was a danger of being sued in Britain, and the calculation was that what we should do is set out as best we can the evidence that the Church of Scientology was an abusive organization, but we weren't able to publish the best allegation, if you like, or the heaviest allegation, which was David Miscavige hit people routinely inside the church. What then happened was that Lawrence Wright did the story, good on him, and then told in his book Going Clear and the film Going Clear, and good on them. I kind of I felt disappointed about that. On the other hand, we had a real go, and the big thing for me, this is before Twitter, 2007. But there are tons and tons of young people who were young people when they saw that at school or students at university who've come up to me and said, I really, I watched that and thank you, because those people who could have got sucked into this evil cult started running in the opposite direction.
Well, and another legacy is that those texts that Mike brought out with him, which document how he and Tommy Davis were being directed in their stalking of you, was entered as a court exhibit. It is an official court document now. Those texts are things that any journalist, any news organization can quote from the court record. And I think it's very important because it does demonstrate, like you said, this real David Miscavige, the one who uses that kind of abusive language, is right there in the court record. So, and again, that we only have that probably some of the most clear evidence of who David Miscavige really is, thanks to the fact that you were their target and that they were doing everything they could to contain you. And then Mike brought that evidence out. So that's one thing that I always think about as a great legacy of those films that you did. Also, I just want to point out that the Tampa Bay Times exposed David Miscavige as beating people.
Yeah. Yes, it did. Yes, yes. The St. Petersburg Times and the Tampa Bay. It was the same, basically the same paper, the same guys. Yes, that's true. That's true. I've forgotten that. Their reporting was essentially Lawrence Wright was the kind of in British World War II terms, the Tampa Bay paper was the destroyer that first identified the Bismarck, and Lawrence Wright was the battleship that sank it.
Right.
But let's not forget the little destroyer. They did a bloody good job. What was frustrating was that we knew, Sarah and I knew this story to be true, but we couldn't get it through the anxiety the BBC had that they would the risk for them was pissing away an awful lot of BBC license payers' money on proving something about an organization that was obviously clearly bad and mad. But journalistically it was tough having to live with that failure. Showbiz, I suppose, is where I that's showbiz, but there we go. Anyway, I do what's funny about it though, Tony, is that a couple of years later I get arrested in Pakistan by the Pakistani secret police, the ISI, and they torture people and sometimes they kill people. And they found us where they didn't want us to be, and there was about 7 of them, and the lead goon, he spoke Oxford English, fancy suit, pitted skin, some male perfume. I didn't like him at all. And he said, I said, have you got who are you? John Sweeney, and I work for BBC Panorama. Can you prove that? Yes. Here's my passport. Here's my press pass. And he gave it to one of the goons who drove off into the dust. And then he turned to me and he said, who are you? And can you prove it? And my Pakistani fixer, Pakistani cameraman, started to look very worried. And I turned to this guy and I said, my name's John Sweeney and I work for BBC Panorama. And I have 7 million hits on YouTube. Look me up. And he went away and then saw the video of me screaming at Tommy Davis. And then came back with my passport and press pass. And they said, I'm terribly sorry, Mr. Sweeney. There appears to have been a terrible mistake. So this beautiful bonkers thing is that because what Scientology did was they put out my me screaming at Tommy Davis with no context out on Saturday afternoon. Panorama comes out Monday evening. So for 3 whole days, I was pilloried across the planet, in particular by stupid people, stupid TV people, a lot of them in the States, but some of them around the world. And the smarter people in the media, including people in the Sun and the Mail, knew there was another side of the story, and they just waited and waited and waited. And basically, I was beaten up as a bad-tempered boor, and somebody with kind of mental health problems for 3 whole days until the show went out Monday evening, and 5 million people watched the show. And I can remember BBC management, who very much adopted the role of a Roman emperor, going to say, okay, so we're not going to say what we think about the gladiator. We put him into the middle of the arena. We're going to see what the plebs think. And as one, the public reaction, certainly in Britain, was, oh, John, you know, we're there with you, we understand, and it's thumbs up. And so after a lot of and I remember this is before Twitter, but I got hundreds of emails, and one was, Mr. Sweeney, you're my hero. I know I'm sounding like a 15-year-old girl, but I am actually the vice president of the Royal College of Psychiatry. And then I'm going to swear now. I'm warning your listeners. But there was an email from the Red Watch of the Lambeth River bit of the London Fire Brigade. And Mr. Sweeney, we're with you the whole way. And when you lost it, we lost it with you. But frankly, we all thought you should have punched that cunt. So a couple of days later, after this, anyway, 5 million views, the most highest watched panorama that year, for 2 or 3 years or something like that. The Deputy Director General of the BBC walked up to me after an awful lot of silence from the bosses and went, "Great programme, John, great programme," and shook my hand and ran away, as was the boss's wont with me. But it was funny. And what we did was told truth to power. And I didn't like it one little bit.
They know they surely did not. Well, John, both of those documentaries were terrific, and of course they meant a lot to me. You and I began corresponding a little bit, and I just wanted to, I don't know if people knew this story or not, but I was a couple years after that in 2013, I was looking for a home for my book about Paulette Cooper. And I happened to mention that to you. And then you told me this wonderful story about how you were walking your dog, Birdie, right? And
Yep.
you ran into a journalist by the name of Humphrey Hunter, who was becoming a publisher, and he ended up publishing a couple of your books. And then you put me in touch with him, and he published my book, The Unbreakable Miss Lovely. I don't know how many people realize that I have you to thank for making that happen. And I just want to thank you again, because I love Humphrey, and I had great experience publishing that book with him.
So Humphrey, it was, no one would publish my book, Church of Fear, about Scientology. And was this bloke here with this tiny, irritating dachshund. Yep, 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 yep. He says, "You're John Sweeney," and yeah, I am. And we walk our dogs together and we chat. I said, "Well, no one's going to bloody publish my book about Scientology. No one will take it." And he looked at me and he said, "I will," and he did. So, but Humphrey's back history is fascinating, because his grandma was a German Jewish psychiatrist anyway, she was German Jewish, and she fled the Nazis, came to England, trained as a psychiatrist, and her son, Humphrey's dad, was a psychiatrist too. And so he understood through, and by the way, together, those two wrote this fascinating book, which set out the medical evidence, which led to the book and then the wonderful play and film about the madness of King George.
Oh.
So that, anyway, but Humphrey knew from his grandma and his dad that psychiatry wasn't a bad thing, and that Scientology was a bad thing. And so so we've got a bond, and Humphrey's my agent, and he publishes some of my books that no one else will to this day. But it's Tony, it's kind of I want to share this to anybody who feels that they're down and life is bad. There's some sweet moments here. So I do a talk. Remember, Scientology hates psychiatry, so psychiatry likes me. And one of the things I pick up a beautiful and fascinating friendship. In 2016, I'm invited, or 2017, I forget which, by the president of the Ukrainian Psychiatric Association, Semyon Gluzman, because he understands that Scientology is operating in Ukraine. It's harming people, many of whom are vulnerable, who've got mental health problems already. And Scientology is not the answer to whatever problems they've got, as Sean Lonsdale would have told them when he's still alive, poor man. And so I get to know Semyon, and Semyon was a brilliant psychiatrist who actually first wrote a report condemning the Soviet abuse of psychiatry in 1971 and spent 10 years in a Soviet gulag for his courage. Because he spent 10 years in the Soviet gulag, he is one of the world's experts on the KGB mindset. So when I came to write my book, Killer in the Kremlin, about Vladimir Putin, one of the key contributors to this is Semyon Gluzman, the psychiatrist, the Ukrainian psychiatrist who understands the KGB mindset better than anyone else on earth, I think. And I know him thanks to the Church of Scientology. Huh. But my gratitude towards the church doesn't stop there. In 2019, and I think your listeners will appreciate this, what happens is I'm at the end of the road of my BBC career, because BBC management have been looking for a reason for getting rid of me, I think. But I make a mistake. I'm a human being, and basically I'm trying to do a panorama about a far-right British guy called Tommy Robinson, and I end up drinking too much with a source. And the source is a woman who used to work with him, and she's fallen out with this guy, Tommy Robinson, and he puts an online hate army against her, and they tell her things like, we're going to give you an acid facial, we're going to rape you with a barbed wire glove. It's very, very bleak and dark. And what I don't understand, don't get, is that she's secretly filming me as we have this conversation. And basically she says, oh, I can't give her any money, but I can take her out for a very nice, long, boozy dinner, which I do twice. And she secretly films me. And what she does is say, oh, can we have some brandies? And then I say, oh, let's have some brandies. And so essentially all the bits where she's leading me astray, as it were, are edited out of this film. Why did she give the film to Tommy Robinson if his followers had threatened her in this horrible way that they did? Because I think she was like Nancy and Oliver Twist, in that she knew that Bill Sikes was a bad man, but she was still in love with him. Mm. So it was a bad time for me, and BBC wanted to effectively sack me. And the union, the National Union of Journalists, said, have you ever had post-traumatic shock disorder? Yes, 3 of my friends have been killed. And in the various wars I've been to, because long before I did Scientology, I was a war reporter, which is why I felt at home doing Scientology, because I was a war reporter. Anyway, so I wrecked my BBC career. I'm in a mess, and BBC are trying to sack me for gross professional misconduct. And I sit in a psychiatrist's waiting room, and it's the bleakest moment of my professional career. And the other people, the other patients in the room, they can see me, and I'm the man from the telly. They could have even seen the films I did for Panorama. Who knows? And I feel very down. And I go into the psychiatrist's waiting room, and he looks at me and he says, before we start, Mr. Sweeney, I just want to say, I really loved your film about the Church of Scientology. And from being this absolute low point, I thought yet again, the church is, it's got my back. And he writes a beautiful report, which says, Mr. Sweeney has a robust and resilient personality, but anyone under extreme pressure can crack. And that made it very difficult for the BBC to sack me. And the BBC hired a professor of psychiatry to fuck my psychiatrist report. And Tony, can you guess what the professor of psychiatry said?
What did he say? I can't guess.
He said, I loved your film about Scientology. What do you want me to write? that meant the BBC could not sack me full stop.
Yeah.
And we came to a decent financial arrangement. They couldn't sack me. I left mutually, beneficial terms. And so I'd very much like to thank the Church of Scientology for looking after me, physically in Pakistan and other places, and financially as well, in a funny way. They so but okay, that's a joke. It's an evil, dark thing, and it fucks you up. And I mean, one of the other funny things is when I did that show in 2007. My kids, so my oldest Sam would have been about 16, 17. I can remember I was worried that Scientology would get to my kids.
Yeah.
And my daughter Molly is, I think I couldn't see my daughter falling for it, but I was worried about my son, Sam. And one day he said, "Dad, can you give me 20 quid because I'm going to the pub?" I said, "But Sam, I gave you a tenner on Wednesday. Like, this is Friday or whatever." I said, "Oh, fine. Don't give me any money. But I just want you to know I'm joining the church." And then as I handed out the 20 quid, I thought, fuck you. So but it said, and he was far too smart and streetwise to go with it. But there's still, I mean, what's fascinating is I'm sure you follow the story, but I'm interested in Scientology's power, soft power in Hollywood to this day.
Yeah.
And I was struck by a story in the Los Angeles Times, which pointed out the following: that there was this movie with Scientology's greatest star, Tom Cruise, Top Gun Maverick, and there's an interesting anomaly, and I'm an investigative journalist and I'm a writer, but the investigative journalist, I'm always interested in anomalies. So the original Top Gun, the baddies are Russian and they fly MiGs, and there's mention of MiGs more than 50 times in the movie.
Okay.
In the remake, very successful Top Gun Maverick, there are no baddies. They might be around, but kind of from the geography, from the climate, you would think it was some kind of Nordic country. So, but it's not Russia. There's no mention of Russia. There's no mention of MiGs at all. So why would that be? And it was only because of the money behind the story of who was the money behind the film came out in an employment case. Somebody was saying that they had been an executive in Hollywood was saying that they'd been unfairly treated.
Right.
And in the detail, it came out that the money behind Top Gun Maverick, or at least a big chunk of that money, was actually owned by a Russian oligarch called Dmitry Rybolovlev. Let's call him Rebo because it's easier.
Yeah, Rebo. Okay.
So Mr. Rebo is a lot of the money. And then what happens is there are no mention of Russians. Now, there may be lots of reasons for this, but here's one: that Mr. Rebo didn't like the idea that the baddies were Russian, and said, as the film was moving from script to being made, and I'm hypothecating, I don't know, and there hasn't been any serious answers. Let's not make it Russia, shall we? Let's keep it anonymous. Now, I don't know whether that happened. That's a hypothesis. I put that to Tom Cruise's publicist, and I got no reply. So what I find a little puzzling is that one of the most hands-on and successful Hollywood stars of the modern age, Tom Cruise, who famously, when he, meets the crew, he remembers everybody's name and shakes their hand and says, "How are you?" and all of that, who is completely into the detail, obsessively so. And as a Scientologist of a high level, is of course a master over space, energy, and time, mass, energy, space, and time.
Right.
He can move ashrays and more. This man doesn't spot the anomaly. Russians in the original, no Russians in the remake. How come? Eh?
I first was approached last year by someone uh, who was attempting to blow the whistle on that, and I wrote that both Vanity Fair and there was another organization, Le Monde, had both paid some attention to this man who claimed that the FBI was looking into this, and that was a story I did last June um, that this New Republic Pictures in Los Angeles had suddenly showed up to sort of rescue Paramount from financial disaster, and this is what helped finance a number of films, not just Top Gun. I didn't hear anything else about it after that. And then all of a sudden, this Ukrainian expat group popped up just before the Oscars to make this claim. And like you, I'm very interested in that. I just don't know if there's a smoking gun about it yet. I don't know if this oligarch's money directly affected the financing of Top Gun or not.
Or the writing of it. So to be fair, it's possible after the making of the movie, The Interview, when the North Koreans hacked Sony,
Right.
there is a kind of nervousness across Hollywood about naming and identifying particular countries.
Sure.
And I can, that's okay, that's reasonable. So that there may be no smoke and no fire. However, when you have Russian money and an actor who is a member of the Church of Scientology, because of Scientology's peculiar behavior over the years, because of the secrecy of the cult, because of the secret way in which David Miscavige operates, and the organization, the cult's use of fear and intimidation against people, then it's reasonable, I think, for people like you and I who have suffered at the hands of the cult to be suspicious. It's, we're not being paranoid. Just because we're paranoid doesn't mean they don't hate us. They do hate us, and all of that. So that, that's another thing. But the story continues. There are good people out there who continue to have lost have lost access to their friends and families. I'm thinking, for example, of Mike Rinder. He's got his kid with his lovely second wife, and that child doesn't know his grandparents, as I understand it, on both sides, because the grandparents are still mental captives of the Church of Scientology.
Right.
And like, it's just one person. By the way, so I went to that wedding when he married his lovely lady,
Christy.
and it was, sorry,
Christy Colbrand.
Yeah, Christy. I've good memory. I'm going gaga. But it was kind of like inviting Satan to your wedding. I spent the entire wedding having to go around doing replaying. You were not there for the beauty.
And do you remember who performed the ceremony?
It was Marty Rathbun.
That's right.
and the tragedy, Marty's tragedy, is that Marty got out and smelt the fresh air of a free world outside the Church of Scientology, and then went back in again, or something.
Right.
And I think the answer to that is that he was a deeply troubled man before he joined Scientology. was troubled inside it, was troubled outside it, and has gone back into it because he thinks it gives them some answers to life's problems.
Right. I don't think he's gone back into Scientology in the sense of being in the Church of Scientology, but there's no question he has once again become Scientology's go-to attack dog,
Yes.
and has
So
put
so
out.
so yes, yes, he hasn't rejoined the spiritual organization,
Right.
but he's running alongside it as an
Yeah.
attack.
Yeah.
And that's kind of sad. But I felt um, of the two of them, Marty was the more difficult character to kind of work with and Mike was delightful.
Right. Right.
But I mean, but in Mike's book, I mean, he talks about, for example, there's a moment where he sees John Travolta kiss another man, and this is like we're in the 21st century. There's absolutely nothing wrong in that.
Right.
The problem is that Scientology has got a hold over him, and for whatever reason, it seems to me, is that John Travolta is in denial of his true sexuality, and that Scientology and David Miscavige's own anxiety or whatever dislike of homosexuality is forbidding Travolta from being the man who he truly is. Now, and Mike writes about that very sensitively and thoughtfully in his great book.
Yeah.
So there is a kind of, and every now and then, but Mike sort of pops up, sends me a message. He was fascinated, for example, that I went undercover to North Korea, and so what's the difference between Scientology and North Korea? Well, Scientology has Tom Cruise, North Korea has nuclear weapons. Other than that, they're cults. Obviously, North Korea is bigger and vastly more frightening, but essentially it's a cult. And again, the great expert on cults is Professor Robert Lifton, who wrote this stunning. He treated American GIs who'd been brainwashed by the Chinese communists who'd been captured in the Korean Civil War and held by the North Koreans. And because of military secrecy, he couldn't write about treating the American GIs, but he wrote about treating Dutch Catholic priests, Chinese businessmen who'd been brainwashed by the Chinese communists. And once again, the enemy of brainwashing, of the totalitarian mindset, is tolerance of humor and tolerance of mockery.
Right.
And the moment I go anywhere near an organization or a group of people where there is no sense of humor, where you can't take the piss out of whoever's in charge, I smell something wrong.
Oh yeah. Like the BBC.
No. Listen, I mean, I fell out with the BBC, and the BBC fell out with me. But I, but I made mistakes. I was the author of my own misfortune. I believe in the BBC. It is a noble thing. It allows British culture to punch above its weight, and I still very much pay its license fee.
Okay.
Do I agree with, like, admire some BBC managers, in particular Tony Hall, former and now disgraced Director General? No, I don't at all. But as a thing, it's a noble thing, and I support it very much.
Okay.
But also, you could take the piss out of it, and I did very often when I was there, which may have been one of the reasons. Well, no, it's a big organization, which but because it's a big organization, it's got a big heart, and and it still works for the public good.
Well, let's talk about Tommy Davis a little bit because he's such a part of your story, and I just wanted to bring you up to date on him to make. I don't know how closely you've been paying attention. You've been so busy in Ukraine and things like that, but of course, he's had a very eventful number of years since your second documentary in 2010. The next year, it's my belief he was fired because he did so badly handling Lawrence Wright, and he basically got bounced from the Sea Org in March 2011, right after Larry's piece had come out in the New Yorker. After that, he spent some time. He went to Tom Barrack, who was his dad's very good friend. Tom Barrack is his wealthy real estate investor. He also spent some time working for James Packer, the Australian billionaire. And he has not left the Church of Scientology. He actually gave a deposition where he said that Tommy Davis is no longer a spokesman for Scientology. He's no longer in the Sea Org, but he is still in the Church of Scientology. He has said that. But I wanted to make sure you knew that he's back working for Barrack, and he's sort of doing for Tom Barrack, this wealthy investor, what he was doing for David Miscavige. But recently, Tommy Davis lost his temper in a very interesting way. I wanted to make sure you knew about this. Paul Haggis had this trial last fall, and his wife tested his ex-wife. I'm sorry, Paul Haggis's ex-wife, Deborah Bernard, had testified as a character witness because she really believes in him, even though they had split up. And Brian Seymour had done some really good reporting, the Australian journalist, about how Tommy was caught in a deposition. A deposition described how Tommy was trying to dig up dirt on Paul Haggis for the Church of Scientology by asking someone to illegally break into files at the Screen Actors Guild. And that person refused. But that person testified in a deposition. This was read out in court, and this apparently made Tommy very unhappy. In other words, the point is, sorry I'm taking so long, Tommy Davis was exposed in court as doing this dirty work for the Church of Scientology, very much like what he was doing to you. Subsequent to that, he accosted Deb Bernard in the street here in New York and blew his top, basically. And I just wanted to make sure you knew that Tommy was, and I reported on that, so that Tommy was caught losing his temper.
Yeah, I kind of, well, we're all human beings, and human beings every now and then, you lose your rag. But I feel sorry for anybody who's still stuck inside the Church of Scientology. His problem is that his entire life, I think his mother is a very, very powerful influence on him. I don't know, is she still alive?
Oh yeah, Ann Archer's alive, and she's still a dedicated Scientologist, no question.
Yes. So I think the problem is that he can't. I feel desperately sorry for people who have been effectively born into the Church of Scientology or near as damn it. And so the problem is they don't know life outside it. So it's a bit like the Truman Show. The framing of their entire human existence is inside this dark cult, but they don't know it's a dark cult, and they don't know that actually life outside is vastly more fun. So you've got someone like Tommy Davis who could be charming. There were little moments where he seemed. There's a moment when we were in the lift together, and I think somebody had to carry Sarah was carrying the tripod. I was so physically and so mentally exhausted. I wasn't thinking straight. I was just, and he was in the lift with us again, which was an irritation because he's denying us any kind of downtime without him, where we all have to be careful of what we say, which is part of their game of continuing total 24/7 pressure. Having said all that, there is this moment where he helps Sarah with the tripod, and he's being charming, but also he's being a kind of servant. And what's strange about Tommy is I think that he enjoys, or he's more at home as being somebody else's butler than he is being his own man or woman. And there's something he works as, at one point he's very, very close to Tom Cruise. By the way, originally back in the day he was called Tom Davis, but the problem is you couldn't have two Toms in the same room, Tom Cruise and Tom Davis, without having to say, oh, you mean Cruise rather than Davis. So the solution was for Tommy to give up his original normal first name, Tom, and he turned himself into Tommy.
Wow.
And then that's the gossip, that's the story I've heard. Then he changes again, or rather, he becomes Miscavige's butler. Then he becomes this guy Barrick's butler. Then he becomes Packer's butler.
Yeah.
He's back to be. So there's a sense that this is a man who is ever so keen on helping a powerful and rich man, who sweeps their table, who gets a dustpan and brush to pick up the crumbs, who puts the drinks in the dishwasher. And there's something, I don't know, there's something slightly wrong about that. And there's something sad about the fact that he isn't a man or, a woman of his own free will. He's dependent on living inside a system decreed by this confidence trickster, L. Ron Hubbard, and then his son on earth, David Miscavige, this psychotic bully and thug. And you think, what the hell are you doing? You've actually got, he's an attractive man. He's fluent. He's got a lot going for him, and yet he's still, to this very day, a kind of butler for dark nonsense.
And he's got a new relationship. He's married an Egyptian actress, and they have a son. And it's nice to hear you being so charitable about him. I guess the message we have, John, is come on out, Tommy. I mean, it's so much better out here.
I would love to sit down and have a pint with him in a pub. And like, but anyway, I just have to wait and wait and wait. Maybe it won't happen. But the difficulty is that these people are brainwashed and they're agents of dark nonsense, and they're human beings too. And I suppose, and I've got to run away and do some other things shortly. But a question for me is, why is understanding and telling the truth about Scientology important? And I think that I also look at other cults, for example, Islamic State, or North Korea. Islamic State, is Islamism, the mad, ferocious, evil end of a great religion, and less so now, but certainly 2014, 15, 2016, 2017, it was doing terrible things both in Syria and around the world, in London too. So the purpose of understanding why Scientology works is not useless, because I know people who were devout Scientologists when I lost my temper in 2007 who have now left. People like Leah Rimini and Mike Rinder.
Right.
And many others too. And what's fascinating is that there was a moment inside their deep brainwashing where they understood that I had been manipulated to lose my temper, and that there was something. So everybody, all the Scientologists were shown, look at this crazy guy. This is the enemy. This is what the enemy is like. What happened was, even inside their brainwashing, people like Mike Rinder and Leah Remini could see that what Scientology was doing to me was wrong. And if we can somehow apply that way of thinking to people who are in Islamic State or people who are inside the North Korean brainwashed nation, then at least you know something, which is that they're still human beings, and some kind of redemption, some kind of exit from the cult is possible or not impossible. And that's how we should think about these people, which, by the way, I'm not at all suggesting we don't fight them. Of course, we've got to fight them. But we have to fight them according to proper rules of law, and the rules of common decency, because they're still human beings, albeit human beings who are locked inside a kind of dungeon of the mind.
John, can you just I know we just have a minute left. Can you just let people know the things you've been doing most recently, and how they can find you these days?
Oh yeah, well, essentially, I don't do much on Facebook, but I have a presence on Twitter, even though Elon Musk mucks around with it. And so I'm at John Sweeney Raw. That's at John Sweeney Raw, as in losing my temper with the Church of Scientology. Yeah, we're not ROAR. And I've got a Patreon account, which essentially is I do when I'm in. I try and spend a lot of my time. I spent most of last year in Kyiv in Ukraine. I reported on the whole of Battle of Kyiv. I never left. I was the crazy old English guy who stayed when lots of the reporters left. And I did a podcast called Taking on Putin, which led to a book, which is a bestseller in Britain, called Killer in the Kremlin, which is out in paperback in Britain, and it's going to be out in paperback in September. So I'm looking essentially at the Church of Putinology, which is like Scientology with Vladimir Putin at its head, as opposed to David Miscavige. But roughly all these things are the same. You've got some kind of messiah. You've got some kind of brainwashing that does harm, and that does brainwashing, and the organization, the thing, does harm. North Korea, Islamic State, the Church of Scientology, the Russian government, the Russian secret state. They're all different, and Scientology actually is probably the least harmful of these four things I've just set out. However, Scientology manages to pull off its dark tricks inside the world's greatest democracy.
Yeah.
Inside the open spaces of Florida and California, you will find dark nonsense. That's what's so weird about it.
It is. It is.
And I am, and you and I have been put on this earth, it turns out, to stand up to this dark nonsense, or at least, as it says in Monty Python, to fart in its general direction.
Well, and listen, I have had the privilege of actually getting together with you in London and having drinks, and it's just been absolutely wonderful. And thank you so much for joining us here at the podcast, John.
Hey, it's been a real pleasure, and keep on fighting the good fight. And I haven't been over I suppose, so I'm going to Ukraine shortly. People sound very brave. All it means is I walk from a zigzag, a rather bar restaurant, to the Buena Vista, the kind of Cuban dancing bar, without falling over in the snow, which is always, that's not very brave, but it's great to stand with the people of Ukraine, who is standing up to another kind of cult, Putin's cult, and I'm confident that they will win through. As I'm confident at some point or other, the Church of Scientology's dark nonsense will fizzle out, but not yet, it seems. Still, anyway, it's been a real pleasure, Tony, and I look forward to seeing you one of these days where we will have a beer.
Okay. Thank you very much, John. I'll talk to you later.
Cheers. Bye.
Now I will go down in Bunker Town again to witness history, write the story. of reckoning, and the day they all come. Oh, but I'm hunkered down in Bunker Town again, again.